Vincenzo is the legal advisor to an Italian mafia boss. His biggest wish in life is to bring down a certain building, so that morning, he dresses up for work and instructs the driver to drive to Emilio's house. As they drive to the location, Vincenzo notices a jet spraying insecticide on the vineyard, but he ignores it. They arrive at the gate, and when the guards see him, they let them in. Vincenzo meets Emilio and presents a document for him to sign, but the man responds by making racist remarks. As they discuss, the jet continues to fly over the vineyard. Seeing that Emilio refuses to sign the files, he stands up and curses the man in Korean before leaving. At this moment, Emilio notices the flying jet and wonders why it is spraying pesticide. But when the jet flies over, he realizes that it's spraying fuel. Meanwhile, Vincenzo calmly walks out of the building. Suddenly, he lit his lighter and throws it away, causing the vineyard to catch fire. Then he gets into his car, leaving Emilio to deal with the damages. Later that day, Vincenzo arrives at a funeral and sadly looks at the body of his boss. After paying his respects, he goes to meet his boss's son and announces that he will no longer work for the Mafia gang since the boss is dead. Then he leaves to go home, but that night, 3 gunmen sneak into his house to assassinate him. He kills them off and immediately travels out of the country. While on the plane, he makes the car of his boss's son explode as punishment for trying to assassinate him. When he arrives in Korea, a taxi driver convinces him to ride in a limousine. While inside the car, he sees bottled water and drinks it. Then he orders the driver to switch the radio to a news channel. The news channel reports that there are recently high cases of drivers spiking foreigners' drinks, but Vincenzo doesn't take the news seriously. He's more focused on carrying out his mission in South Korea. While deep in thought, he suddenly finds himself feeling sleepy. Meanwhile, Mr. N, an agent who works in the intelligence bureau, receives a report that a dangerous Italian mafia has arrived in the country. He panics and reports the case to his director, but the man doesn't take the case seriously and even brushes it off. At this moment, Vincenzo is being robbed of all his belongings. The taxi driver and his cohorts find wards of dollars and other valuables on him. They even debate that his wristwatch alone would cost over 100 million won. As they argue this, Vincenzo wakes up, but they quickly knock him out. After a long time, he gains consciousness and finds some cash around his fingers. He yells in frustration, but eventually picks up the cash and uses it to pay for his transport to Gnumba Plaza. When he gets to the plaza, he stares at it and expresses his desire to tear down the building. The plaza originally belonged to a Chinese businessman who connived with him to start gold in the basement of the building. Now he wants to tear down the building to access the gold. While looking around, Mr. Cho comes to meet him and informs him that a company named Babel wants to buy and demolish the building in order to construct something. But Vincenzo can't let this happen because he needs to access the gold underneath the building. Mr. Cho leads him to a room in the building where he'll be staying. The man also volunteers to introduce him to the tenants occupying the building. One tenant is a psycho who plays piano, another is a lawyer, another is a dry cleaner that threatens to kill him, and another is a chef who owns an Italian restaurant. One of the tenants owns a dancing school, another tenant fights with his wife all the time, while the last tenant is a mother and son duo that also fights each other. Vincenzo is overwhelmed by the entire thing, so he instructs the man to leave him to the basement where the gold is hidden. But he soon discovers that the room leading to the basement was rented out to a monk who runs a temple. The monk doesn't know that he's sitting on a vault that leads to tons of gold. After confirming that the basement is safe, Vincenzo takes his dirty suits to the dry cleaner in the building, but while leaving, he sees all the tenants peeking at him. One of the tenants, who is a lawyer, introduces himself, so Vincenzo plans to meet with all the tenants the next day. He goes back to his room and takes a chaotic bath and a shower that wasn't malfunctioning. Before sleeping, he reviews a document and finds that his mother, who was wrongly accused and sent to jail, is eligible for retrial. Coincidentally, the lawyer in charge of the case is Lawyer Yu Chan, one of the tenants in the building. The next day, he goes to visit the prison his mother stays at, but he leaves after staring from outside. Immediately after he leaves, Lawyer Yu Chan arrives to pay a visit to a woman in the prison. The woman doesn't have hope of being released, but the lawyer assures her that all will be well. After leaving the prison, Vincenzo goes to meet the representative of Babel Company. The man offers him a huge amount as a way to convince him to sell the building, but Vincenzo turns down the offer. When the man sees his stubbornness, he threatens to make Vincenzo regret his actions. After the meeting with the man, Vincenzo also gathers all the tenants in the building and promises to compensate them if they decide to relocate from the plaza. But unfortunately, Mr. Cho goes home and finds out that his family has been held hostage. The assassins threaten to kill his wife and daughter if he doesn't sign the documents to sell the plaza. They wait in his house until the next morning to make sure that he receives the payment for the building. Meanwhile, Cheong is a lawyer who works for Babel Company. One day, she arrives at work and sees a mysterious file on her table. Once she opens, she discovers that it's a document from her father. She rushes to his house and questions why he was disowning her. It turns out that he no longer wanted her as his daughter because she worked for a corrupt company. As they argue about this, one of the tenants runs to inform them that the plaza is about to be demolished. At the same time, Vincenzo receives a call from Mr. Cho. The man informs him that he was threatened to sign away the plaza. While telling Vincenzo the details, a truck comes out of nowhere and hits him. The thugs leading the demolition arrive at the plaza for demolition. They threaten to deal with any tenant who opposes the demolition. A lawyer, Yu Chan, boldly confronts him. So in response, one of the thugs pushes him. Chaeyoung is angry at this, so she steps forward to defend her father. She gets into a brawl with the thug, and when he's about to beat her, Vincenzo suddenly interrupts them. Vincenzo steps forward and offers to settle the matter through peaceful discussion, but the thug is pissed off at his confidence and tries to fight him, but Vincenzo easily overpowers him. Seeing this, the leader of the thug decides to have a peaceful discussion, but Vincenzo is no longer in a peaceful discussion. He suddenly throws a punch at the thug and even pushes him out of the window. The thug holds onto a tiny rope to save himself from falling. Vincenzo forces the thug to stop the demolition. Once the man agrees, he gets pulled up from the window, but after seeing a scar on his hands, the thug orders his underlings to beat up Vincenzo. As they're about to engage in a fight, police arrive at the scene and inform everyone that reporters are outside. After everything calms down, lawyer Yu Chan accuses Vincenzo of secretly selling the building to Babel Company. Vincenzo tries to explain the situation, but no one believes him, so he angrily leaves. Once he leaves, a reporter steps in and tells lawyer Yu Chan that Vincenzo was the one who gave out tips to the reporters. As Vincenzo angrily stomps off, Chaeyoung runs to meet him. She's curious and wants to know why he doesn't want the plaza to be sold. She tells him that she suspects he's hiding something. Later that day, Vincenzo meets with Mr. Cho to discuss their next plan. Cho advises him to move out the golds before the demolition takes place. But this is impossible because the engineer of the secret basement built a mechanism that will cause the building to collapse if anyone tries to forcefully open the basement. The basement has a biometric lock, so they need the iris of the owner to unlock it. The owner of the gold is a Chinese businessman, but Vincenzo had found out years ago that the businessman died from cardiac arrest, and his family members don't know about the secret gold. Vincenzo visits the temple inside the building and stares at the opening that leads to the basement. One of the monks catches him staring, so he pretends to be looking around the temple. He eavesdrops on the monks' conversation and realizes that they plan to change the heater on the floor. But Vincenzo doesn't want them to tamper with the floor, so he interrupts their conversation and promises to buy an electric pad for the floor. Meanwhile, Mr. An is still fixated on catching Vincenzo, so he submits a report on Vincenzo to his boss. The report is from the Italian intelligence service. Mr. An believes that Vincenzo is in South Korea to create a rebel mafia gang, but his boss thinks the whole thing is absurd because Vincenzo doesn't have enough money to create a mafia group. However, Mr. An believes that Vincenzo has a secret fortune hidden somewhere. He begs his boss to investigate the matter, but the man warns him not to waste the institution's resources. Mr. An doesn't give up. He calculates the money in his account and realizes that it's enough for him to carry out a personal investigation on Vincenzo. Meanwhile, Vincenzo meets lawyer Yu Chan and asks for information about Babel Company because he wants to fight against the company. But the lawyer doesn't trust Vincenzo, so he refuses to share information about Babel. However, Vincenzo manages to convince him, so he instructs Mr. Ju-sung to give Vincenzo all the information about Babel. Chaeyoung, on the other hand, is having a problem at her workplace. Her assistant Jang informs her that a researcher who's a witness in a court case has escaped. She begins to panic because the researcher has enough evidence that can stop her from winning a court case. She decides to visit her father at his office since he's the opposing lawyer in the case. Outside, she sees the chairman of Babel Company and runs to fawn over him, but he ignores her and walks away. She's pissed off, goes to see her father. When she arrives, she sees Vincenzo studying all the documents related to Babel Company, so she becomes curious and asks why he's interested in Babel. He responds that he intends to take down Babel since it's a corrupt company. Lawyer Yu Chan agrees with this, which makes Chaeyoung shocked that her father is getting along with Vincenzo. After Vincenzo leaves the office, she follows him and asks why he wants to fight against Babel. She joins him for dinner in order to get to the root of his plans, but he doesn't tell her much about his plans. Nevertheless, she advises him to lay low or leave the country because Babel isn't a company that anyone can go against. That night, Chairman Hanseo, whom everyone believes to be the chairman of Babel, isn't actually the one in charge. His older brother beats him up for delaying the demolition of the plaza, so Hanseo promises to speed up the demolition process. In the following days, Chaeyoung experiences more problems in her workplace. Her boss, Mr. Sung, has employed a new lawyer to join their team. The new lawyer, Ms. Choi, is put in charge of all the lawyers, so Chaeyoung isn't happy about it. Meanwhile, Vincenzo and lawyer Yu Chan plans on how to stop the demolition of the plaza. They go out for a drink and make small talk while getting to know each other. During their conversation, Yu Chan tells Vincenzo about a woman who was wrongfully accused of killing a rich businessman. He also tells Vincenzo that the woman suffers from pancreatic cancer. Coincidentally, this woman is Vincenzo's mother. He gets curious and asks why the woman is in jail for a crime she didn't commit. So Yu Chan tells him that the woman thinks it's her karma for abandoning her son when he was little. While discussing the matter, Yu Chan receives a call from an unknown number. The person doesn't say a word on the call, so he concludes that it's a prank call. Meanwhile, Cheong attends a work meeting and discovers that Babel plans to demolish the plaza. She's worried that the tenants in the building will lose their lives during the demolition, but her boss doesn't care about her worries. After the meeting, she storms into her office and complains to her assistant about her father's stubbornness. She wonders why he's adamant on staying in the building. One day, while cleaning Sung's office, the assistant, whose name is Jang, discovers the exact time and date that the demolition will take place, so he runs to inform her about it. When she hears this, she rushes home to inform her father about the development, but he's having a meal with Vincenzo, so he doesn't take her words seriously. As she tries to explain the seriousness of the situation, he receives a call from an unknown number, so he excuses himself to answer the call. The person on the phone call is the researcher who escaped from Babel, the man to reveal every detail that could bring down Babel Company. Once lawyer Yu Chan hears this, he storms off to meet the researcher. Cheong is frustrated that her father refuses to listen to her, so she tells Vincenzo that Babel plans to demolish the building the next day. She begs him to evacuate the tenants, but he also doesn't take her seriously. Meanwhile, lawyer Yu Chan meets up with the researcher. The next day, it's almost 11 p.m. Cheong is worried about her father. She calls him on the phone to remind him to evacuate, but he ends the call abruptly. She begins to panic and rushes out to meet him. While in the car, she receives a call from her boss. He yells at her for not informing them earlier that one of the researchers had escaped. But Cheong isn't in the mood to answer his questions, so she ends the call and drives to meet her father. The constructors and engineers prepare to demolish the plaza. Cheong sees their vehicle on the road and overtakes them. She rushes into the plaza to meet her father, but when she gets to the building, she's shocked to see a festival holding tons of influencers and important guests are present in the festival, even Mr. An. It turns out that Vincenzo had planned the festival with the tenants in order to prevent the demolition. Cheong sees Vincenzo at the party and tells him that she wants to speak with him. They go to a private area, and she asks why he's willing to go this far to prevent the demolition of the plaza. He responds that he has fallen in love with the building, but she doesn't believe him. The thugs and engineers arrive at the venue for demolition, but they find out from a policeman that the Italian ambassador was present at the festival, so there's no way they can continue with the demolition. That night, Cheong meets with Mr. Sung and the newly employed lawyer. They criticize her for hiding the fact that the researcher had escaped, but she assures them that everything is under control. After the festival is over, Vincenzo wonders what to do next to stop the demolition. He picks up a file and contemplates on an idea. The next day, while going to meet lawyer Yu Chan, he comes across Mr. An. Although Mr. An acts suspiciously, Vincenzo doesn't find any fault in him. Mr. An goes to meet one of the tenants who is a chef. Then, he begs the chef to employ him as a cleaner in the restaurant. He did this in order to secretly investigate Vincenzo. Meanwhile, Vincenzo meets with lawyer Yu Chan, and they plan on how to take down Babel Company. They discover that the Babel pharmaceutical subsidiary plans to produce a drug that contains narcotic. No one knows about this, so they plan to expose the truth. In the middle of the meeting, Vincenzo receives a phone call and rushes out. Mr. An sees him leaving and grows suspicious, so he secretly follows from behind. It turns out that Vincenzo was only rushing out in order to help the monks fix the heating mat. Mr. An sees this and misunderstands. He begins to think that Vincenzo is a mafia with good morals. Lawyer Yu Chan stands at the rooftop and wonders how to take down Babel Company. He remembers the night he had met with the researcher who escaped. The man had told him that the new drugs being produced by Babel is capable of killing thousands of people. The researcher agrees to appear in court and testify only if lawyer Yu Chan guarantees his safety. As Yu Chan contemplates on how to ensure the safety of the researcher, Vincenzo comes to meet him at the rooftop and advises him to back off from the case, since it is very dangerous to go against a big group like Babel, but the lawyer is stubborn. As they argue about this, he receives a call and begs Vincenzo to follow him. Vincenzo follows him cluelessly and they arrive at the hospital, so it turns out that his mother had been admitted to the hospital. Lawyer Yu Chan checks up on her and even introduces Vincenzo to her, but she didn't know that Vincenzo was the son she abandoned years ago. Vincenzo feels uncomfortable meeting his mother, so he excuses himself and goes out. That night, he meets up with one of the higher-ups in charge of the demolition. He tells the man to delay the demolition for 2 months. When the man disagrees with this offer, Vincenzo shows him a file containing evidence of bribery that could put the man in jail. He also shows the man incriminating pictures that could ruin his marriage. The man begins to panic, so Vincenzo promises not to reveal the evidence if the man delays the demolition. However, the man reveals that he isn't powerful enough to delay it, but Vincenzo doesn't care. So that night, as the thugs begin the demolition, the man calls and instructs them to cancel the plan. After the meeting, Vincenzo visits lawyer Yu Chan for a late-night drink. While drinking, Yu Chan reveals that he already knows that the sick woman is Vincenzo's mother because they had once met years ago in court. He had also seen Vincenzo visiting the prison where his mother was staying. Unknown to them, an assassin had sneaked into the villa where tons of researchers were staying. The assassin plants a bomb that kills all the researchers. The next morning, when Yu Chan sees the news, he storms off to check out the burned villa. When he arrives, the police inform him that investigation into the case has been closed, since there was no evidence that someone planted a bomb at the villa. As lawyer Yu Chan confronts the police, Vincenzo notices some strange men at the area, so he stops Yu Chan from causing a scene. He tries to convince Yu Chan to give up on the case, but the lawyer thinks it's his destiny to fight against Babel. While thinking about the situation, lawyer Yu Chan receives a call from the runaway researcher. The man is now willing to testify in court because he's scared of getting bombed just like his colleagues. Yu Chan is happy about this and decides to meet him the next morning, but they didn't know that Miss Choi, the newly appointed lawyer, had already gotten intel on the whereabouts of the runaway researcher. Meanwhile, Vincenzo meets up with the tenants in the building and informs them of his plans to relocate them to a new apartment free of charge. They think his offer is too good to be true, but he convinces them to accept the offer. He does this because he plans to secretly move out the hidden gold from the building. After the meeting with the tenants, he goes to meet lawyer Yu Chan. He immediately discovers that the lawyer is in a good mood. But this mood is ruined when Cheong storms in and confronts her father about his decision to oppose Babel Company. During the argument, she says some hurtful things to her father before leaving. While going to the convenience store, Vincenzo sees Cheong drinking alone. He advises her to apologize to her father. At the same time, Ms. Choi eats alone in her house. She calls someone and gives him the command to carry out a secret plan. That night, Vincenzo drinks together with lawyer Yu Chan as a way to comfort him. Unknown to the both of them, their lives are about to change drastically. The runaway researcher is at his house when he hears a knock. The person at the door claims to be a police officer conducting an inspection, but the researcher grows suspicious and begins to pack up his things to escape. The fake police realize his intentions and begin to break down his door, but the researcher manages to jump out of the window before they get in. As he escapes, the fake police begin to chase him. At the same time, Yu Chan and Vincenzo are having a drink. Yu Chan excuses himself to take a smoke outside. His phone begins to ring, but Vincenzo ignores the call and even ends it. He didn't know that the call was from the runaway researcher. The researcher is hiding to call lawyer Yu Chan, but the assassins find and kill him. When Yu Chan returns from taking a smoke, Vincenzo informs him about the missed calls. As Yu Chan picks his phone to return the call, suddenly a van appears from nowhere and hits the both of them, causing Yu Chan to bleed. Cheong arrives at the scene to apologize to her father, but gets shocked to see him in a pool of blood. Vincenzo and Yu Chan are rushed to the hospital, but Yu Chan ends up dying while Vincenzo responds to treatment. Cheong is devastated at the death of her father. To make matters worse, the news reports that her father was a corrupt lawyer who was under investigation for violating some Lawyers Act. While Cheong is sad about his death, Ms. Choi celebrates alone in her room. The tenants at the building pay their last respect to lawyer Yu Chan, and Cheong often visits the hospital to check up on Vincenzo. While all this is happening, Babel Company finalized the production of the dangerous drug since there is no more opposition. As for the runaway researcher, his body was found beside the sea. After some days, Cheong decides to close down her father's law firm. She visits Vincenzo at the hospital and cries about her situation to his unconscious body. She wants him to wake up quickly so that he can narrate his own side of the event. Suddenly, Vincenzo opens his eyes and jumps out of the bed. He claims to be fine, but Cheong is still worried about him. He assures her that he's fine before leaving the hospital. He goes to pay his respects to Yu Chan at the cemetery. But while leaving, Cheong tells him about her plans to investigate her father's death. Vincenzo advises her to stay out of it, but she doesn't listen to him. While driving home from the cemetery, she hears the news about the runaway researcher's death. According to the news, it was suspected that the researcher had committed suicide. Cheong begins to suspect foul play, so she calls a detective to get more information. Once she discovers the researcher's death is suspicious, she storms into her company to submit her resignation letter. She told Mr. Sung that she finds it suspicious that her father and the researcher died on the same day, so she believes it's a scheme from Babel. Sung tries to stop her from resigning, but Ms. Choi comes in and tells him to let her go. Cheong decides to move into her father's house with the help of her assistant. Meanwhile, Vincenzo is having a hard time coping with the death of Yu Chan, so he revisits the scene of the accident. After studying the area, He calls Mr. Cho and gives him an instruction to carry out. At the same time, the chairman of Babel Company walks into his room to see something covered with a blanket. When he uncovers it, he sees a pillow with tons of syringes on it. This makes him scared, so he reports the case to Ms. Choi and Sung. Since the two can't think up who would do such a thing, they decide to put the blame on Cheong. So when the chairman hears that Cheong is the prime suspect, he orders for her to be arrested and investigated. Meanwhile, Cheong has decided not to close down her father's law firm. She meets with all the tenants in order to get to know them. They're happy about her decision, but in the middle of their celebration, the police storms in to arrest her. One of the tenants goes to beg Vincenzo to help release Cheong, but he shuts his door and refuses to help her. The next day, Cheong's assistant Jang goes to the police station to release her, but he doesn't have substantial evidence to show that she didn't commit the crime. Vincenzo suddenly appears with a CCTV drive that proves that she didn't leave the building on that particular day. After her release from the police station, she follows Vincenzo to a cafe. She suspects he's behind the syringe incident, so he confesses that he was actually behind it. He also tells her that her father was in contact with the researcher that died. She gets angry at him for hiding such information, but he warns her not to get involved. That night, she decides to team up with someone powerful in order to bring down Babel Company, but everyone she calls either turns her down or refuses to pick her calls. So the next day, she meets up again with Vincenzo and offers to help him win back his building, but in exchange, they'll have to team up to bring down Babel. After some thoughts, Vincenzo agrees to her offer. Together, they go to the prison to visit the driver who caused the accident that killed Yu Chan. After some threats, the driver confesses that a man named Mr. Pugh had ordered him to hit Yu Chan. He also gives out the phone number of Mr. Pugh. Meanwhile, Ms. Choi gets information that the driver had revealed the truth to Cheong and Vincenzo, so she orders for him to be killed. That night, some inmates get into a fight with the driver and stab him, causing him to die. Cheong and Vincenzo learn about the driver's death, so they make their next move to meet the alleged Mr. Pugh. But Yu Chan's secretary, Mr. Jun, overhears their conversation and begs them to include him in their plans. That night, Vincenzo visits a casino and waits patiently for Mr. Pugh. When the man leaves to go to the restroom, Vincenzo follows him and knocks him unconscious. Then they use his phone to contact his accomplices. When the accomplice arrives, they also knock him unconscious with a taser. They tie up the two men, and Vincenzo threatens to kill them if they do not confess who ordered them to kill Yu Chan. When they refuse to talk, Vincenzo kills one of the men, which shocks Cheong. The remaining man decides to confess. Ms. Choi is practicing her evening exercise routine when she receives a mysterious package. Once she opens it, she sees some blood-stained clothes. At the same time, she receives a text from a restricted number. The text contains pictures of the two dead men. The light in the gym goes off, so she tries to leave, but the doors are locked. Then she receives a call from a restricted number. The caller is actually Vincenzo. As she talks to him, she sees a truck from afar, and she gets reminded of the way Yu Chan died. As the truck approaches her with speed, Vincenzo offers to spare her life if she clears Yu Chan and the researcher's name. That night, a group of men in masks visit Babel's pharmaceuticals warehouse and claim to be disinfecting the warehouse. But they spray fuel in the entire warehouse, and before leaving, one of them throws a lighter to burn up the entire warehouse. It turns out that Cheong, Vincenzo, and Mr. Jung were the people in masks. Once they leave, the entire warehouse explodes. Although it looked like they killed Mr. Pugh, in reality, it was a plan to make the other man confess. The chairman hears about the fire incident and rushes to the warehouse, but the explosion blows him away. As he struggles to stand on his feet, a car drives in and someone mysterious steps out. The chairman begins to shake in fear. It turns out that the mysterious man is actually Jang, Cheong's assistant, who's the real chairman of Babel. Jang stares at the fire scene with anger in his eyes. Back at home, Chairman Hanzio begs Jang for a chance to take care of the damages, but Jang chokes him with a towel and commands him to order for an immediate board meeting in the company. While driving off to carry out the commands, Hanzio sneers and calls himself a puppet in the hands of Jang. Meanwhile, Vincenzo and Cheong are celebrating their small victory with a drink. They begin to plan their next step, and Cheong proposes that they target another subsidiary under Babel, which is Babel Chemicals. The next day, they begin to carry out their plan. Vincenzo visits the gym to speak with Hanzio. He pretends to be a huge fan of the Hanzio's stock policies, but after chatting for a while, Vincenzo leaves because he realizes that Hanzio is too dumb to be the real chairman of Babel. Cheong, on the other hand, chats with her assistant about the fire outbreak. She doesn't know that he's the real chairman of Babel, so she expresses how happy she is about the fire outbreak. Once she ends the call, Jang pulls off his pretense and instantly suspects that she was behind the fire outbreak. Cheong and Vincenzo meet again at the cafe to go through their plan. Vincenzo tells her about his suspicions that Hanzio isn't the real chairman of Babel. So they begin to plan on getting rid of the puppet, Hanseo, in order to draw out the real chairman. At this time, Ms. Choi is panicking. She wants to know who's behind all the weird things happening, so she decides to pay Vincenzo a visit. When she gets to the building, Mr. Jung pretends to be Vincenzo, but she can easily tell that he's an imposter. She drops the flower pot she brought as a gift before leaving. Outside, she sees Vincenzo together with Cheong, and his demure tells her that he's the one she's looking for. They sit together for a meeting, but Vincenzo refuses to talk, because she would easily know that he was the man who threatened her on the phone. After leaving, she becomes confused and drops her suspicions of Vincenzo. Assistant Jang receives a promotion at the company, so he visits Cheong to share the good news. To celebrate his promotion, they go to have a spicy meal. Meanwhile, one of the tenants who is a monk goes to visit his friend at the hospital. This friend works at Babel Chemical and had collapsed during the launching of a chemical. The monk suspects that the illness has to do with Babel Chemicals, so he quickly informs Cheong and Vincenzo about it. When he explained the situation to them, they realized that the friend had gotten ill from working with toxic chemicals. So the next day, Vincenzo and Cheong visit Babel Law Firm and announce their decision to represent victims of the toxic chemical in court. While negotiating, Ms. Choi hears Vincenzo's voice and realizes that he's the secret man who threatened her on the phone. Once the duo leaves, she tells her suspicion to Mr. Sun, and they finally conclude that Vincenzo and Cheong are behind the fire outbreak at the warehouse. On the day of the trial, Vincenzo and Cheong arrive in an expensive car, which shocked the reporters. Vincenzo gives a speech in Italian, and the tenants make a display to show that Babel chemicals were toxic. But Vincenzo and Cheong don't have enough evidence for the court case, so they decide to ruin the trial. As the judge prepares for the case, one of the tenants bumps into him and splashes water all over him. She offers to clean his clothes, but he turns her down. Afterward, he meets with Ms. Choi and Sung. It turns out that the judge had collided with Babel to make Cheong lose the case. As the trial begins, Cheong shows signs of anxiety. When the judge calls her out to defend the victims, she begins to panic and even takes drugs to stabilize herself. As she begins to talk, she suddenly collapses. The judge decides to adjourn the case to later in the day, but this wasn't what Vincenzo and Cheong had planned for. They wanted the case to be adjourned to another day. Seeing that it wasn't going according to plan, Cheong suddenly stands on her feet and claims to be fine. As she begins to speak on the case, the light suddenly goes off. This was their plan B. However, the judge is stubborn and orders for the trial to continue even in the darkness. Since their plans are about to be ruined, Vincenzo signals the tenants to carry out the last plan. Two of the tenants secretly release some bees from their jacket. Once everyone hears the buzz of the bees, chaos disrupts in the court. It turns out that Vincenzo and Cheong had planned with the tenants to spill honey mixed with water on the judge. So once the bees are released, they immediately rush to bite the judge. The judge's face swells from the bite, but he still insists on carrying on with the trial. While announcing the verdict of the case, the judge suddenly faints, so the case is adjourned. After the court trial, Vincenzo goes to visit his mother in prison to inform her about lawyer Yu Chan's death. He bids her farewell and also tells her about his intention to leave the country soon. She gets sad since no one will ever visit her. Meanwhile, Ms. Choi and Sung are planning their next course of action. Ms. Choi requests for a tech team because she had once placed a wire tap on the flower pot she gave as a gift on her last visit to Vincenzo. But the wiretap doesn't reveal anything because Vincenzo had seen through her plan and had given the flower pot to one of the tenants instead of placing it in his office. Vincenzo and Cheong have a drink at a bar to celebrate their small victory in the first trial. While drinking, Vincenzo reveals to Cheong that there's over $1 billion worth of gold in the basement of their plaza. But Cheong doesn't take his words seriously and thinks he's drunk. She even laughs about it and leaves. Things are beginning to get heated on Babel's company side. Chairman Hanso holds a meeting with Ms. Choi, Sung, and Jang. During the meeting, Jang reveals that he's actually the real chairman of Babel Company. Both Ms. Choi and Sung are shocked, but they immediately pay their respect to Jang. Hanseo tells them to keep the revelation a secret. Afterward, Jang instructs them to win the court case and silence all the victims. He promises to promote Ms. Choi if she succeeds in the case. Ms. Choi returns home and begins to panic, but she immediately comes up with an idea and makes a call to her subordinate. The next day, the police arrest the victims of the toxic chemical and accuse them of embezzling the donations made to them. This is because Ms. Choi had ordered her men to plant money in the house of the victims. On the day of the second trial, Cheong is very tense while Ms. Choi is ready to win the case. However, Cheong stands up and announces that she has a surprise witness to help her case. The judge gives her permission to bring in the witness, and to everyone's surprise, the witness is Vincenzo. Vincenzo steps into the court to act as both a witness and assailant to the case. It turns out that he had assaulted some of the higher-ups of Babel Chemicals and had stolen their phones. He presents the foam as evidence because it contains proof that Babel Company was trying to cover up their toxic chemicals. As Vincenzo presents the text message evidence as hard copy, Miss Choi signals the judge to reject the evidence. Seeing this, Vincenzo then reveals that the doctor in charge of the case had also given the wrong diagnosis in order to thwart justice. So Cheong calls in a more professional doctor. The new doctor provides tons of evidence to prove that the victim suffered from the toxic chemicals. Since she's the wife of the fake doctor, she also provides proof that her husband had been bribed by Babel Company. Chaos breaks out between the husband and wife, so Vincenzo and Cheong end up winning the case. After the trial, Jang orders Hanseo to announce that Babel Company will end the production of the toxic chemicals. Jang is angry about their loss, so he drives both Ms. Choi and Sung to a desert. He wants to teach them a lesson for losing, but Ms. Choi begs for forgiveness and begs him to give her a chance to redeem herself. So he orders her to take down both Vincenzo and Cheong within 3 days. Meanwhile, Vincenzo learns that the building will be demolished in a week, so he meets up with an engineer to survey the basement building. The engineer informs him that forcefully opening the secret pathway could lead the building to collapse, so Vincenzo plans on how to access the gold before the building is demolished. But unknown to Vincenzo, the tenants in the building had gotten information about the tons of gold hidden underneath the building. A homeless man, who was present when the gold was moved, revealed the information to them. When Vincenzo meets the tenants and tells them of his plan to evacuate them into a new building, they suddenly begin to protest. Meanwhile, Babel Company suffers loss after losing the court case, so Jang tells Ms. Choi and Sung to find out ways to get funding from the bank. But no bank wants to be involved with Babel after they lost the court case. While this is going on, Vincenzo and Cheong learn that Vincenzo's mother had developed pancreatic cancer and was at the final stage of the illness. Ms. Choi, on the other hand, negotiates with the president of a bank for funding. Vincenzo also learns from Mr. Cho that there's a way to access the gold using the iris of the Chinese owner. After a while, Vincenzo and Cheong find out that Babel Company will be receiving funding from Nag Bank to produce the toxic chemicals, so they plan on how to stop this. Cheong discovers that the president of Nag Bank is gay, so she convinces Vincenzo to make the president fall in love with him. So Vincenzo pretends to be gay and meets up with the president at a horse stable. The president falls in love with him at first sight, so they go out on more dates. On one of the dates, Vincenzo tries to convince the president to back away from funding Babel Company. When the president doesn't agree, he breaks up with him and leaves. But the president is already madly in love with him, so he comes back to apologize. He even decides to listen to Vincenzo and back away from funding Babel. On the contract signing day, Vincenzo and Cheong attend to watch the drama. After Chairman Hanseo signs the document, the president of the bank refuses to sign because Vincenzo was present to dissuade him. But as Vincenzo and Cheong thought they had won, the mother of the president arrives and signs the document instead. It turns out that Ms. Choi had met up with the woman because she suspected that Vincenzo would pull a stunt to hinder her plan. After Vincenzo and Cheong lose, Ms. Choi mocks them for losing and even insults Cheong's dead father. Cheong becomes angry, so she reveals to the reporters that Babel Company is corrupt. She also tells them that she plans to uncover all their corrupt practices for the world to see. Vincenzo pulls Cheong away from the crowd of reporters, and when they get to a bar, they begin to plan on how to make the real chairman of Babel show himself. One day, while eating potatoes at the office, they find out that Chairman Hanseo has a senior brother who studied abroad, but they are unable to find pictures of him. At the same time, Jang also informs his brother that he has sent someone to Italy to find out more about Vincenzo. Meanwhile, Vincenzo and Cheong are planning to get information about the real chairman from people who have close ties with Babel Company. Vincenzo meets up with Mr. Cho again in a car, and the man informs him that he has gotten data on the Chinese client's iris. Now, all they need is to gain access to the basement and remove the gold. But the basement was rented by a monk who owns a temple. Vincenzo meets the monk and begs him to relocate to a better place, but the monk disagrees. Jang communicates with a foreign client and is able to get more funding to produce the toxic chemicals. When Vincenzo, Cheong, and Mr. Cho read the news about the funding, they are more devastated. Cheong is sad that all her dead father's effort will go to waste. At the same time, Mr. Cho receives a text from the victims of the toxic chemicals. The victims were going on a trip to celebrate because they didn't know that Babel had received fundings to produce the chemicals. But the next day, Cheong receives a suicide text from one of the victims. When they arrive at the scene, they see that all the victims had died in a car with charcoal burning inside the car. They visit the police station and try to convince the officers that the victims were murdered, but the police don't believe them because all the evidence points that it was suicide. The officers refuse to listen to their reasoning and even tell them to leave the station. After leaving work that day, the two police officers visit a locker room to get a bag of money. As they go to the rooftop to split the money, Vincenzo suddenly appears and takes a picture of them with the money. He snatches their bag of money. They try to fight him, but he beats up the two of them and even ties them up. He threatens to throw them off from a high building if they don't provide evidence the victims were actually murdered. Meanwhile, Seung is tired of obeying Jang, so he tries to convince Chairman Hanseo to kill Jang and become the real chairman. On the other hand, Vincenzo learns from a friend in Italy that someone is snooping for information about him, so he decides to be careful. After some days, Vincenzo and Cheong get evidence from the officers that show that the victims were actually murdered. The case was staged to look like they committed suicide. Although the evidence is substantial, it won't be enough to present in court, so they decide to bring justice through another way. After planning with the tenants in the building, Vincenzo and Cheong conducts an online broadcast with their faces covered. In the broadcast, they reveal all the corrupt things done by Babel Company. When Jang, Ms. Choi, and Chairman Hanseo watch the video, they realize that it's a plan to make the real chairman expose himself. The online broadcast gains views, but Ms. Choi orders the media companies not to release articles on it. Meanwhile, Jang gets information on Vincenzo's real identity. His private investigation also gives him pictures to prove that Vincenzo was behind the death of multiple people in Italy. This news makes Jang very excited and happy. Vincenzo goes alone to lure out the assassins who murdered the chemical victims. Mr. Jung calls Cheong to inform her about it. She's having coffee with Jang when she gets the news, so Jang decides to drive her in order to stop Vincenzo from confronting the assassins. However, Vincenzo is able to gun down the assassins. After winning them, he unlocks their phones and gets the phone number of the real chairman. So when Cheong and Jang arrive at the scene, he tells Cheong that he has gotten the phone number of the real chairman. He decides to call the number, and in their presence, Jang's phone begins to ring, but no one suspects him. Since no one answers the call, Vincenzo and Cheong meet with a dead end again. Vincenzo leaves together with Cheong in a car. On their way, he orders Mr. Cho to get information about the phone number. After some days, Mr. Cho calls to inform him that information about the phone number has been deleted from the cell tower, so there's no way to know who the real chairman is. Although they're at a dead end, Vincenzo is able to get data on the last location that the phone number received a call from. From the data, they realize that the chairman was with them when they caught the assassins, but even with this, they do not suspect Jang. Instead, they believe that the real chairman was hiding somewhere to watch them. Meanwhile, Chairman Hanseo and Jang's brotherly relationship is getting bad. While having a meal, Hanseo begs Jang for an opportunity to supervise one of Babel's subsidiaries, but Jang overturns the dinner table and accuses his brother of having thoughts of becoming the real chairman. Mr. An, who has been working as a cleaner to investigate Vincenzo, gets information that Vincenzo will be arrested for committing several crimes in Italy. His boss warns him to stay out of the matter, but he begs the boss to interfere and prevent Vincenzo from receiving injustice. At this time, Vincenzo is arrested and taken for investigation. The police shows him pictures of the people he killed in Italy. Due to his relationship with the Mafia, the police plan to deport him to Italy. While taking Vincenzo to prison, Mr. An interrupts them and announces that the South Korean Intelligence Bureau will oversee the case of Vincenzo. Both Cheong and Vincenzo are shocked because they didn't know that Mr. An works at the Intelligence Bureau. Mr. An has a private meeting with them and promises to help them fight against Babel Company. During the meeting, Vincenzo inspects the photos that were used as evidence against him. He realizes that whosoever got the photos from Italy must know the real identity of the chairman, so he immediately calls his friend in Italy and begs him to get information on who took the photos. When the friend sends him CCTV video of the suspect, Vincenzo employs the help of Mr. An to get information about the suspect. Meanwhile, the tenants decide to tell Vincenzo about the gold hidden somewhere in the building. They want his help to find the gold, but Vincenzo is shocked that they know about this. He tries to convince them that it's fake information, but they do not believe him. While this is going on, Mr. An is able to get data of the man who took the photos. When Vincenzo gets this data, he decides to find the man in order to get information about the real chairman from him. As they make their plans, Jang calls Cheong and invites her out for a drink, so she tells Vincenzo to continue digging for information while she meets Jang. Vincenzo sends his men to kidnap the suspect. They tie up the suspect and threaten to kill him if he doesn't reveal information of who the real chairman is. The suspect gets scared and reveals the secret. Once Vincenzo hears this, he immediately calls Cheong in the middle of her dinner with Jang. He tells her to act normal, and then drops the bombshell that Jang is actually the real chairman. That night, as Jang returns home, Vincenzo suddenly barges into his house and aims a gun to shoot at him. But Jang isn't scared. He even orders Vincenzo to shoot and kill him. But as Vincenzo is about to kill Jang, security barges in and arrests him for attempted murder. Cheong arrives at the police station and sees Jang leaving. She slaps him for deceiving her and attempts to beat him up, but Ms. Choi pulls her away and tells her to worry about Vincenzo, who had been arrested for illegal firearm possession and attempted murder. During interrogation, Prosecutor Jung discovers that the gun used were fake. So he realizes that Vincenzo had no intention to kill Jang. It turns out that the plan was to find a way to meet and discuss with the prosecutor. Prosecutor Jung is someone who also wishes for the downfall of Babel Company, so Vincenzo makes a proposal to support his fight against Babel. Vincenzo is eventually released, and when Jang hears about this, he's pissed off. One day, as Vincenzo and his team plan on how to take down Babel, two tenants visit and tell him not to worry about finding the gold, because they have found a gold expert who can easily locate the gold. Both Chaeyoung and Mr. Jung are shocked to hear about the gold. So when the tenants leave, Chaeyoung begins to question Vincenzo, so he has no choice but to reveal that there's gold in the building worth trillions of dollars. Meanwhile, the National Intelligence Bureau is in chaos because news has leaked that an important guillotine file, which was supposed to be safe, has been stolen. As Vincenzo and his team debate on how to share the money from the gold, Mr. An storms in and informs them about the missing guillotine file. He explains that the file was stolen years ago by a Chinese businessman. The Intelligence Bureau suspects that the Chinese businessman had hidden the file somewhere in South Korea, but now that the businessman is dead, no one knows the location of the file. As Mr. An explains the situation, Vincenzo realizes that the dead Chinese businessman is the same man who had instructed him to store the gold. Vincenzo begins to suspect that the Chinese must have hidden the guillotine file together with the gold in the building. Now that the whole country knows about the missing file, Ms. Choi is also on the hunt for it since it contains details that can bring down powerful men in the country. While everyone is focused on the guillotine file, Jang goes hunting with his brother Chairman Hanseo. During the hunt, Hanseo decides to shoot and kill Jang in order to become the real chairman. But his shot isn't accurate, so Jang only suffers from mild bleeding. Jang is rushed to the hospital and recuperates. He calls a private meeting with Ms. Choi, and they both decide to announce to everyone that he's actually the real chairman. Meanwhile, Vincenzo decides to open up the basement to check on the state of the gold. Mr. Cho uses the artificial iris to unlock and access the underground basement. They get underground and see tons of gold, but suddenly, Mr. Cho points a gun at Vincenzo and threatens to kill him. Mr. Cho picks up only one gold from all the starch and instructs Vincenzo to get out of the basement. Once they climb out, Cho tries to leave, but Vincenzo suddenly reveals that about the guillotine file inside the gold bar. Mr. Cho becomes distracted, so Vincenzo snatches the gun and points it at Cho. While all this is going on, Jang holds a meeting with Babel's board of directors and reveals that he's the real chairman. On the other hand, Mr. Cho gives up since Vincenzo has gotten the gun. He begins to reveal that he's actually a Secret Service agent who was sent to investigate the Chinese businessman who stole the file. When he discovered that the Chinese hid tons of gold, he killed off the man and stayed beside Vincenzo's side in order to access the guillotine file, which was hidden with the gold. Mr. Cho reveals that he has no interest in the gold. All he wants is the file. As they discuss this, they overhear the sound of the tenants returning home. They begin to panic and quickly close the entrance that leads to the basement. But due to the rush, Vincenzo mistakenly throws the file and artificial iris into the basement before closing it. Now that the artificial iris is stuck inside the basement, they have no other way of retrieving the golds. Chang, on the other hand, learns about the missing guillotine file, so he also plans to get his hands on it. Meanwhile, Hanseo privately meets up with Sung to discuss their failed plan of killing Jang. Hanseo is scared that his brother will retaliate one day, so Sung advises him to lay low and act like an idiot in order to make Jang lower his guard. After announcing himself as the real chairman of Babel Company, Jang gets invited to give a speech at a renowned university. While giving a presentation to the students, the screen changes to show a video clip that exposes Babel's involvement in corruption. Reporters swarm around to take pictures of the drama, and as Jang tries to make out what's happening, a pool of pig blood splashes on him. It turns out Vincenzo and Cheon had planned everything in order to humiliate him. Although Jang is angry at the situation, he's escorted out by his security, but police stop and arrest him for his involvement in corruption. During the interrogation, Ms. Choi orders Prosecutor Jung to also arrest Cheong and Vincenzo for spilling blood on Jang, but Cheong claims that she was only pulling a prank on Jang, so the prosecutor dismisses her case. Meanwhile, the prosecutor insists that Jang will be arrested. After Vincenzo and Cheong leave, Hanseo stands up and decides to take the blame for his brother, but the chief prosecutor comes in and orders Prosecutor Jung to put an end to the case and release Jang. After his release, Jang celebrates with his team and criticizes his brother for trying to take the blame. He advises his brother to take the blame for bigger crimes like tax evasion. Hanseo leaves the meeting together with Sung. Outside, he tells Sung of his intention to team up with Vincenzo in order to take down Jang. Meanwhile, Prosecutor Jung is disappointed with how the whole arrest turned out. He tells Vincenzo and Cheong that the only way to take down Babel Company is to find the guillotine file because it contains all the details of Babel corruption. It turns out that Prosecutor Jung knows the location of the file because he's close friends with Mr. Cho, unknown to them. Ms. Choi has contacted a mafia boss in Italy who is a big enemy of Vincenzo. The next day, Vincenzo secretly meets Hanseo and Sung. Hanseo wants to kill his brother and take over the company, so offers to collaborate with Vincenzo. However, Vincenzo turns down his offer because he doesn't want to be involved in family disputes. Vincenzo continues to work with his team to find evidence of Babel's involvement in tax evasion. But unknown to him, the tenants in the building had found someone who can locate the gold in the building. They invite the person over, but when the man arrives, he reveals that he's no longer in the business of finding gold since the job wasn't fulfilling enough. After the gold finder leaves, Ms. Su, one of the tenants, secretly meets with Vincenzo, Cheong, and Mr. Jung. She reveals that she's actually the programmer who programmed the iris and demolition codes for the hidden gold. She tells them that she can access the secret basement without the iris recognition device. Since there are lots of golds in the basement, Vincenzo tells her to wait until they find a way to transport all the golds. In the meantime, Vincenzo and Cheong go on a mission to uncover Babel's money laundering schemes. They even employ the help of Ms. Su to hack into a financial account and get evidence of tax evasion and laundering. But while they're focused on getting evidence against Babel, some Italian assassins arrive into the country to assassinate Vincenzo. When Vincenzo gets home, he's ambushed by the assassins, but as they're about to kill him, swarms of birds appear and cause a distraction. He uses this opportunity to snatch the gun and kill the assassins. Meanwhile, Jang and his team are panicking because Vincenzo has already submitted evidence of Babel's tax evasion to the authorities. Ms. Choi advises Jang to leave the country, but as they prepare to leave, Ms. Choi receives a text message that includes pictures of the dead Italian assassins. Jang realizes that they've lost, so he tries to escape from the country, but Prosecutor Jung arrives with police and presents an arrest warrant to Jang. In the presence of everyone, they arrest Jang. The next day, Vincenzo gathers all the tenants to watch the news about Jang's, but when the news starts, they're shocked to realize that Prosecutor Jung had switched sides. In front of the reporters, Prosecutor Jung announces that Babel Company is actually innocent, and that they were wrongfully accused. Jang and his brother Hanseo excitedly watch this news, but Cheong is angry at the sudden change of event, so she angrily breaks the television. It turns out that on the night that Jang was arrested, Prosecutor Jung had negotiated a deal with him. Jung asked to be promoted to the position of chief prosecutor, and in exchange, he promised to show Jang where the guillotine file is located. Cheong, on the other hand, is still angry at their loss with Babel. As she complains about this to Vincenzo, he brings out a file and announces that it is the guillotine file. According to him, he had removed the file from the gold and hid it in his pocket. Then he pretended to throw back the gold into the basement to deceive Cho. Now he plans to use the file to expose Babel Company once and for all. He reads the file together with Cheong and Mr. Jung. They discover that the details in the file is enough to bring down tons of high-ranking people. As they debate on what to do with the details in the file, Hanseo suddenly storms into the office. He begs Vincenzo to help get rid of his brother. Vincenzo turns him down again after realizing that Hanseo is too dumb. At the same time, Jang is planning on getting the guillotine file because Prosecutor Jung had told him the location of the file in gold. He plans to quickly demolish the building and get the file. One day, Mr. Jung informs Vincenzo and Cheong about an information he discovered while looking through the guillotine file. According to the file, Jang had killed some of his classmates while in high school, but his father covered up the case with money. The file also notes that Jang takes the wristwatch of his victims and keeps them as trophies. When Vincenzo learns of this, he disguises a shaman and convinces the CEO of a media company to expose Jang's past in the news. Once Jang watches the news, he begins to wonder how the CEO knew about his past. He suspects that Vincenzo is behind it. One day, Vincenzo returns home and sees a masked man around his room. He chases the man to the rooftop, but eventually loses track of him. But as he turns around, he's shocked to see the dead body of the CEO of the media company. Before he can make out what's happening, police arrive and accuse him of killing the CEO. As the police is about to arrest him, he suddenly begins to fight them. He manages to overpower the police and escape. When he gets to a safe place, he calls Cheong and informs her about the setup. He plans to prove his innocence, and luckily for him, one of the tenants had seen and caught the masked man. Once they threaten and question the masked man, they're able to get information on his accomplices, so they invade their hideout and capture them. Then they take the criminals to the police and report that they are the ones responsible for the death of the CEO. It turns out that the criminals had killed the CEO and transported his body to make it seem like Vincenzo was responsible for the death. Right now, Babel is facing tons of lawsuits from both Cheong and Vincenzo. The guillotine file allows them to find tons of incriminating evidence against Babel. As Jang contemplates what to do, Miss Choi receives a text from Cheong, so they meet up for a meal. It turns out Cheong has more incriminating evidence that can put both Miss Choi and Jang in jail for 30 years. She threatens Miss Choi with the evidence, but the woman isn't scared at all. Meanwhile, Jang is attacked in his house by multiple masked men. He manages to fight them and escape before they kill him. He runs away from them and escapes Hanso's house. However, he still sustains an injury in his feet. Jang experiences another attack at his house when some masked men enter his house and try to kill him again. He makes a narrow escape, but since his life is currently in danger, so Miss Choi advises him that the only safe place is prison. She tells him to admit to some of his crimes and stay in prison for some weeks while she finds a way to bring down Vincenzo. The next day, police arrive at Babel Company and arrest Jang for tax evasion. When he's put in jail, Vincenzo visits him and reveals that it was their plan all along to make Jang go to jail. Vincenzo was behind the masked men who attacked Jang. He wanted Jang to feel unsafe and choose to stay in prison. Vincenzo and the tenants finally decide to open the secret basement for the gold with the help of Ms. Suh, a programmer. To avoid suspicion, they secretly relocate the gold by moving it out in small bags. They eventually succeed in moving out the entire storeroom of gold. Jang is arraigned in court, and Vincenzo steps out as a witness to testify against Babel Company. He presents formidable evidence that puts the entire court in chaos. Due to the lawsuits against Babel, the news reports that the Gnunga Plaza will no longer be put up for demolition. When the tenants watch this news, they begin to celebrate. And since Jang is in prison, Hanso becomes the new chairman of Babel Company. And on his first day of office, he put in E98 nin to the production of the toxic chemicals. Meanwhile, Vincenzo goes to visit Jang in prison to gloat about their success. Then he shows Jang a new model of Babel building to show that Babel will be no more soon. When Jang sees this, he becomes angry and promises to escape from prison to deal with Vincenzo. That night, Vincenzo eats dinner with Hanso and advises him to go abroad for a few months. Since Hanso betrayed his brother, Vincenzo believes that Jang won't spare him. But Hanso refuses to travel out because he wants to stay and fight against his brother. Meanwhile, Miss Choi fabricates evidence to prove that she had pressured Babel to engage in tax evasion. Then she meets Jang and tells him about her plan to take the blame so that he can be released from prison. When Jang hears this, he promises to make her the vice chairman of his company once everything settles. Before leaving, she informs Jang that his brother is now working together with Vincenzo. When she returns home, the police go to arrest her. That night, she spends her night in prison while Jang is let out of prison. After his release, he goes after Cheong and kidnaps her. He also sneaks into his brother's office to kidnap him. That night, Vincenzo waits for Cheong's return. But instead, he sees a suspicious shadow in his window. He picks up a gun to go outside, but no one is outside. Instead, there's a suspicious package on the floor. When he opens it, he sees a bloodied earring that belongs to Cheong. He immediately realizes that Jang is behind it. Jang locks both Cheong and Hanso in a room. Then he calls Vincenzo and tells him to hurry to a certain location. Vincenzo arrives at the place and gets searched by security before he's let in. When he opens the door, he sees Cheong and Hanso tied up. As he goes to untie them, Jang stops him with a gun, but he doesn't intend to kill Vincenzo. Instead, he gives his brother a metal rod and orders him to beat Vincenzo to death with the rod. He promises to spare the brother if Vincenzo dies. When Cheong yells at him to stop, he slaps her and threatens to kill her first. But Vincenzo quickly goes on his knees and begs Hanso to beat him with the rod. However, Hanso suddenly stands on his feet and begins to fight his brother instead. Vincenzo sees the chaos and uses the opportunity to untie Cheong. As they're about to escape, Jang frees himself from his brother and picks up a gun to shoot Vincenzo, but Cheong takes the bullet. Jang raises the gun again to kill Vincenzo, but Hanso interferes, so Jang kills him off. Then he tries to shoot Vincenzo, but there's no bullet. Seeing the situation, he jumps out of the window and escapes. Vincenzo goes to check up on Hanso, but he dies in his arms. Fortunately, Cheong's situation isn't critical. When she wakes up in a hospital, she makes Vincenzo promise to get revenge on Jang. The next day, Vincenzo gives the guillotine file to Mr. An and tells him to use it to bring justice to the country. Afterward, he calls Mr. Sung and orders him to release Ms. Choi from prison within 3 hours. Meanwhile, Jang buys weapons from a dealer and also hires a group of men to work for him. Ms. Choi is released from prison. Outside, she receives a call from Vincenzo, and he informs her that Mr. Sung has betrayed her. She immediately drives to her office to retrieve a secret phone. She calls Jang with it, so he orders her to wire 5 billion won to her account as a gift for her services. Unknown to them, Vincenzo has tapped her phone with the help of Mr. An, so he's able to track the location of Jang. As he goes to find Jang, Ms. Choi successfully transfers the 5 billion into her account. But as she goes to her house to pack up some things, she's shocked to see Vincenzo on her couch. He informs her that the billions she transferred have been intercepted by a hacker. Then he kidnaps her to a strange place and ties her up. She tries to convince him to let her go, but he responds that her death will be extremely painful. Before leaving, he turns on a tap that splashes her with fuel. Then he throws a lighter to set her on fire. As he walks away, Ms. Choi burns and dies from the fire. Meanwhile, Vincenzo's men are tailing Jang when he tries to escape through a seaport. They step out to fight and stop him. Jang stabs one of the men and tries to escape, but Vincenzo arrives in time to shoot and kill him. The police arrive at the location, so Vincenzo escapes with Jang in the back seat. He takes Jang to a secret place and traps him in a chair with some mechanism. Then he reveals that the mechanism will pierce his body every 5 minutes until he dies a painful death. Jang begins to beg for mercy, but his cries fall on deaf ears. Vincenzo activates the mechanism and leaves Jang to die in pain.